Imagine a house you have lived in for a very long time. You know every room. You know which floorboard speaks when you step on it, which window lets in the most light in the morning, where the draft comes from in winter, which corner of the kitchen smells faintly of something warm even when nothing is cooking. And then one day something changes. Someone leaves, or something ends, or the world rearranges itself in a way you did not ask for and could not have prepared for. And you walk back into that house, and it feels different. Not wrong, exactly, but different. As if the rooms are the same shape, but the light has shifted by just a few degrees. As if the air holds a different quality. As if the house itself is quietly grieving alongside you, because it too knew what was here and can feel that something is now absent. This is one of the most disorienting things about grief. The world looks the same. The house is still the house. The street is still the street. The ordinary things continue being ordinary. And yet, inside you, something has fundamentally changed. And the gap between how the world looks and how it feels creates its own particular loneliness. If you are lying here tonight with that feeling, the feeling of a house that has been altered, of familiar rooms that no longer feel quite familiar, of a world that has not changed and yet is somehow not the same, then you are welcome here. You are in exactly the right place. You do not need to have words for what you are carrying. You do not need to understand it or explain it or have made any peace with it at all. You're allowed to bring it exactly as it is. All of it. The weight and the confusion and the particular quality of ache that comes in the night when the ordinary business of the day is no longer there to cover it over. Take a moment now, if you would, to settle. Let your body find the bed a little more completely. You do not have to hold yourself up. The mattress, the pillow, the floor beneath, they are here. They have always been here. You do not have to do anything with what is on your mind tonight. You are not required to solve it or sort it or arrive somewhere different before you sleep. Perhaps that has been the quiet burden of many nights before this one. The sense that rest cannot come until something is resolved. That the mind must first do one more round of the question before the body is allowed to be still. But resolution is not what we are moving toward tonight. Tonight, we are only moving toward rest. Let that be enough. Take one slow breath wherever you are and let it go without any effort. Let the air do its own returning. We are going to walk together through some of the oldest understandings that human beings have ever held about loss and grief, and the strange particular way that things end. These are not new ideas. They are not the narrator's ideas. They belong to a long conversation that people have been having with one another across centuries and languages and the wide difference of their lives. A conversation that has taken place in monasteries and kitchens and at bedsides and at rivers' edges. Ordinary people and teachers and fishermen and potters and grandmothers, all trying to say something honest about the same thing, about what it is to have loved something and to carry the fact of its changing. You do not need to agree with any of it. You do not need to remember any of it. You do not need to take notes or arrive at conclusions or emerge from tonight with anything other than a little rest. It is enough simply to listen, the way you might listen to rain, receiving it without having to do anything in return. If you happen to live somewhere where rain sometimes comes at night, the soft sound of it on the roof, the particular quality of the world that rain creates, you may know the feeling of lying in bed and simply allowing the sound to be there, neither trying to listen more carefully nor pushing it away. That is all this is. Sound in the dark. Something to accompany you. Something that asks nothing. There is a teaching that appears in many forms and in many traditions, though it is perhaps most closely held in the Buddhist understanding of things. It goes something like this. All things arise and all things pass. Not some things, all things. Not the things we hold loosely, the ones we don't much care about. All things, including the things we hold most tightly, the ones we would give almost anything to keep. This teaching is sometimes called impermanence. The word can sound cold and philosophical when you first meet it. It can sound like something carved into stone, abstract, remote, meant for scholars in cool rooms with long afternoons to think. But lived inside, impermanence is not cold at all. It is one of the warmest things there is. Because what it is really saying is this. You are not broken for having lost something. You are not failing at life. You are not doing it wrong. You are doing exactly what all living things do. You are experiencing the nature of things. You lie down at night, and the grief is still there. And perhaps you have wondered, in the way that the mind wonders at this hour, what is wrong with you, that it has not lifted yet, that you have not moved past it, that you are still here in this place of heaviness, while the world around you seems to carry on. But the ancient teachers would not say that anything is wrong with you. They would say that you are paying very close attention. You are noticing what is real. The grief that remains is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of the depth of what mattered. The grief that will not leave is, in its own quiet way, a kind of honesty. It is the heart's way of acknowledging that something was real. And things being real, things mattering, is not the problem. Things mattering is perhaps the most human thing there is. Let us explore a story about this. Long ago, in a small village near the edge of a wide valley, there lived a woman who was known for her extraordinary garden. She had tended it for most of her life, and it was, by all accounts, remarkable. Not because it was large or ornate, but because of the particular care she brought to it every day. She knew every plant by name. She knew which ones needed more shade and which ones reached toward the sun. She knew when to water and when to leave well enough alone. She knew which ones would come back in spring and which ones were tender and needed protection through the cold. People sometimes came from neighboring villages just to walk through it in the early morning, when the light was still soft and the dew had not yet dried. One autumn, a very long frost came early. It came before she had time to prepare, before she had done the things she usually did to shelter what was tender. She woke one morning to find that much of what she had spent years cultivating was gone. She stood at the edge of the garden in the cold light, in the stillness that comes after something has been irrevocably altered, and she was very quiet for a long time. A traveling teacher happened to be passing through the valley that morning. He had walked many roads and slept in many places, and he had the kind of face that made people feel they could be solemn, they could be honest in his presence. He stopped at the edge of the woman's garden and stood beside her in the quiet without speaking first. After a while, he said simply, "What has happened here?" She told him. She told him about the frost, about the years of tending, about the particular plants she had loved most, the ones that were now gone. She spoke plainly, without drama, because the thing itself was plain and large enough, without any embellishment. He listened without moving, and when she was done, he said only this, "It sounds like you loved it very well." She looked at him. She had expected something different, perhaps, something instructive, something about new seasons coming, or the soil still being good, or the spring that would come. But he said none of those things. He only acknowledged the love that had made the loss possible. She was quiet for a long moment. And then something in her settled, not resolved, not healed, but somehow recognized. She nodded slowly and said, "Yes, I suppose I did." He stayed for tea. They did not speak much more. And when he left, the garden was still gone. The frost had not been undone. The loss was real and the cold was real, and nothing had changed about the facts of that morning. But the woman felt, for the first time since she had walked outside and seen what the night had done, that she was not doing something wrong by grieving. She had loved it well. That was the whole story. And somehow, that was enough to carry her through the afternoon, and through the evening, and through the first hard weeks of the empty garden. Perhaps you can feel what that woman felt. Not the resolution, but the recognition. The permission to let the love and the loss be the complete story, without needing to add anything else to it, without needing a moral about what comes next or a lesson about what you should do differently. Because grief is, in the deepest sense, the shape that love takes when its object is gone. It is not an illness that comes after love. It is not love's failure. It is love continuing, moving through a space that has changed shape. And when we understand it that way, when we can look at the heaviness we are carrying and say, "Yes, this is what it looks like to have loved something," then something in the carrying shifts. Not disappears. Shifts. The weight is the same. The angle is different. Tonight, as you lie here, perhaps you might try something small. Not a task and not a practice, only a noticing. Think of what it is you grieve, whatever it is, whatever form it takes, and for just a moment, without analysis or effort, or the need to go anywhere with the thought, allow yourself to feel what it means that it mattered to you. That you are grieving it at all is evidence of something real and good in you. The capacity to love enough to grieve is not a curse. It is, perhaps, the most precious thing you own. Let that be here tonight, alongside everything else. Take a moment now to feel the weight of your body in this bed. Notice the places where you are held, the back of your head against the pillow, the length of your spine along the mattress, the backs of your heels, finding the bed beneath them. You do not have to do anything with this. You are simply here, in this body, in this bed, in this night. When you are ready, we will go on together. There is an image that appears again and again in very old teachings about the nature of the mind and the nature of grief. It is the image of muddy water. When water is disturbed, when the sediment and sand are churned up from the bottom, it becomes cloudy. You cannot see through it. Everything is obscured and moving. And the instinct, when you look at that cloudy water, is to do something about it, to try to reach in and clear it, to stir it differently, to pour in something clean, to fix it with effort. But the old teachers notice something that the instinct misses. If you leave muddy water alone, if you simply set it down and stop trying to clear it, the sediment settles on its own. The water clarifies itself. Not because you did something right in the end, but because you stopped doing the thing that was keeping it churned. The stillness is not an achievement. It is what remains when the interference stops. The grieving mind is something like this. When we are inside grief, the mind is often full of images, of memories, of questions, of regrets, of stories about what might have been different. And the temptation, especially in the stillness of the night, when there is nothing else to attend to, is to try to sort through all of it, to reach in and begin to organize, to ask the right questions and find the right answers, and arrive at some resolution before morning. And this reaching in, well, it usually only churns the water more. The more we stir, the cloudier things become. What the muddy water teaching is trying to say is not that you should feel nothing, or that the grief is a problem to be emptied. It is saying something subtler and more useful than that. It is saying that the mind has its own capacity to settle, not by force, not by discipline or willpower, but by the same gentle stillness that clears cloudy water, simply by being left to do its own quiet work without interference. You do not have to think your way through the grief tonight. You do not have to understand it or organize it or arrive anywhere. Perhaps the most useful thing you can do, and truly the only thing required of you, is to lie here and let the water find its own stillness. Let us explore a story about this. There is a story sometimes told about a young student who could not stop thinking. He was a bright and genuinely earnest young man, devoted to the practice of quieting his mind. But the more deliberately he tried, the worse it seemed to become. He would sit in the early morning trying to be still, and his mind would fill immediately with the day ahead. He would sit in the evening trying to release the day, and his mind would replay every moment of it in careful detail. He began to believe that he was somehow constitutionally wrong for this kind of inner life, that the stillness that others seemed to find came easily to them, almost naturally, but was being withheld from him specifically, as though he had been built differently, and the teacher's instructions simply did not apply to someone like him. He went to his teacher and described his situation with great precision and considerable despair. He used many words. He described the thoughts and the quality of the thoughts, and the frequency of the thoughts, and the way they seemed to multiply whenever he tried to reduce them, like pressing on a spring that only coils tighter under pressure. His teacher listened carefully and without interruption, and when the young man finished, she picked up a small jar of water from beside her and handed it to him. The water was cloudy. The jar had recently been shaken, and the fine sediment from the bottom was still suspended throughout it in swirling patterns. She said, "Do you see how cloudy this is?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Clear it for me." He held the jar and looked at it. He tilted it one way and then another. He tried stirring it gently with one finger. He tried breathing slowly over the top. He tried holding it very still and then holding it at a slight angle. Everything he tried either made the water cloudier, or kept it equally unclear, or created new disturbances just when things seemed about to settle. After some time, he looked up at her, feeling somewhat foolish and a little more desperate than when he had arrived. She smiled gently. She took the jar back and set it down on the table between them and said, "Now we will wait." They waited. They did not speak. The young man, who had arrived full of urgent words and urgent questions, found himself gradually becoming quieter, not because he had succeeded at anything, but simply because there was nothing else to do. The waiting had its own texture, and after a while he looked at the jar. The water was clearer, not perfectly clear, but much of the sediment had drifted downward, and through the upper part of the water he could begin to make out shapes and light. She said, "This is what the mind does when we stop disturbing it." He sat with that for a long time. The relief that moved through him was not the relief of having solved something. It was the relief of having discovered that he did not need to solve it, that the settling was already in process, already happening, the moment he got out of the way. This is available to you tonight. The settling is already happening, even now, as you lie here. The water does not need your help to become clear. It only needs you to stop stirring. Let us also explore another story that comes at this from a slightly different angle. There was a fisherman who lived in a village by the sea and had fished the same waters for most of his life. Over the decades, he had developed an extraordinarily fine sense of when the water was right for fishing and when it was not. He could not always explain it in words that satisfied other people, but he knew. Older fishermen sometimes asked him how he had developed this quiet knowing about the water, this ability to read what was there. He would say something like, "I stopped arguing with it. When I was young, I thought I could make the water into what I needed it to be. I thought that the right effort at the right moment would change its nature. I was wrong many times, and the wrongness cost me. And slowly, I learned to read what was already there rather than trying to impose what I wanted. Once I stopped arguing with the water began to tell me things. The grieving mind that is arguing with itself, insisting that the grief should not be there, that it should have passed by now, that something must be done about it tonight, is the young fisherman pushing against the water. What the older fisherman found was not indifference. He still cared deeply about his work. He still brought skill and full attention to the water every morning, but he brought them in a spirit of collaboration with what was, rather than in opposition to it. And the water, the real water, with its real conditions, was far more generous with him than it had ever been when he was fighting it. You do not have to fight the grief tonight. You can simply be in the same water with it, reading what is here, neither pushing against it nor being swept away. Just here, just breathing, just the weight of the body settling, and the water finding its own level. Let your shoulders come down now, if they have been holding. Notice the sounds around you, whatever sounds are there, without needing to identify or analyze them. Simply the sound of the world continuing, your breath continuing, the body doing its gentle, reliable work without being asked. We will go on together in a moment. Perhaps one of the oldest conversations about grief is the one about time. The strange way that time moves differently when you are inside loss. How it can make everything feel both very far away and very near at once. How a moment from years ago can arrive in the chest with the weight of yesterday. How yesterday can feel like something from a former life you barely recognize. We often say about grief that time heals. And perhaps there is something in that, something partial and true, a gesture toward a real thing. But the teachers who thought most carefully about impermanence would say something a little different. They would say that time does not so much heal as it reveals, that what shifts is not that the thing becomes less real or less important, but that we begin to see it from more angles. We walk around the loss slowly, as one walks slowly around something large and still, and we discover that it has many faces. The loss which once looked only like absence begins, over time, also to look like presence, like the particular irreplaceable shape of a love that was real. And we cannot rush that walking around. It happens at the pace that it happens. That is its nature. The teachers would not say, "Do this to make it faster." They would say, "Walk at the pace of the thing itself, and trust that the walking is happening even when you cannot feel yourself moving." Let us explore a story about this. In an old monastery set into the side of a mountain, there was a teacher who was known, above almost all other things, for his equanimity. Not his brilliance, though he was brilliant. Not his kindness, though he was kind. But his equanimity, the quality of remaining clear and present in the midst of difficulty, neither swept away nor armored against. His students watched him closely over many years and could find no moment when he seemed rattled by what was happening around him. Then one winter, his closest friend died. They had known each other since they were young men, studying together, arguing philosophy late into the night, walking the same roads through many seasons. The loss was profound, and the students, who had been watching their teacher for so long, waited with a complicated curiosity to see what his equanimity would look like now that it was being asked to meet something real. Instead of equanimity, they found him sitting alone and weeping. One student, startled and confused, came to him quietly and said, "I thought you understood impermanence. I thought you had made your peace with the nature of things." The teacher looked up from his grief. His eyes were clear, even through the tears, and he said, "I have. And this is what it looks like." The student did not understand at first. He had believed, without quite realizing it, that understanding impermanence meant being immune to grief, that having made peace with the nature of things meant the things could no longer reach you. But the teacher was pointing to something far more honest than that. He was pointing to the possibility of being fully in the feeling, not above it, not protected from it, and also being something that could hold the feeling without being undone by it. He was in the grief, and he was also more than the grief. Both were true simultaneously. Neither cancelled the other. This is perhaps the most difficult and the most important thing the old teachers noticed, that we do not become too wise for grief. We simply learn that grief and the one who carries grief are not the same thing. The grief is real. The carrier is also real. And the carrier is invariably larger than the carried. There is a second story that fits alongside this one, approaching the question of time from a softer direction. Consider a small story about a traveler who was crossing a wide and empty plain on a day when the weather could not make up its mind. In the morning, it had been perfectly clear and bright, the kind of morning that promises things. By midday, clouds had gathered heavily from the west. By afternoon, the rain had come, and it was cold, and the traveler was wet through. By evening, the rain had passed, and the sky had opened into something extraordinary. Layered pinks and deep oranges, the light doing things that light only does after rain has cleared the air. A person at a roadside shelter asked the traveler, "What was the weather like today?" The traveler thought about the question, which turned out to be more interesting than it had seemed, then said, "It was all kinds of things." This is, I think, perhaps the truest possible description of what a day inside grief is like. It is all kinds of things. Even the hardest days are not made only of hard things. There are moments, small moments, unremarkable ones, when something else arrives. A cup of something warm, a sound from outside that is pleasant, a brief stretch of the afternoon when the weight lifts for no particular reason. These moments do not betray the grief. They do not mean the grief is finished or that it was not real. They are simply the rest of the weather moving through. And the sky, in all of this, remains. The weather comes and the weather changes, and the sky is still there. The same sky, holding all of it, the morning brightness and the afternoon rain, and the extraordinary evening light. All kinds of things. You are the sky as much as you are the weather. Perhaps tonight it is difficult to feel that. Perhaps the weather is very much present, and the sky is very hard to locate. But it is there. It is always there. And slowly, not by effort, not by trying, but by the natural passing of time, the weather moves through. Rest for a moment now. Let the breath come and go without shaping it. Feel the quiet weight of the blanket. You are here, in this body, in this night. Everything else is simply weather. and weather, without exception, moves. One of the most quietly remarkable things in the old teachings on impermanence is an idea that can sound, at first, almost too simple to be useful. It is the idea that grief is not permanent. The grief itself is subject to impermanence. This is not a platitude about time healing, and it is not an instruction to feel better soon. It is the same honest observation applied consistently. All things arise and pass, including the heaviness you are carrying right now, including the particular shape and weight of this loss. The teachers did not say this to dismiss or to hurry the grief. They said it because they had observed something careful and true, that the mind, when it is inside grief, tends to project the current state of things into the future without evidence. It says, "This will always be this heavy. I will feel this way forever. I will never again be light in the way I was before." And this projection, this assumption of permanent pain, is itself a kind of additional suffering that the grief does not actually require. It is the second layer, added on top. The grief is hard enough. The projected eternity of it is harder still, and also imaginary. You do not know how the grief will change shape. Neither does anyone else, because grief is particular. It belongs to you and to what you have loved, and it follows no timetable that anyone else can give you. But the teachers, having sat alongside many grieving people through many long seasons, had noticed consistently that it does change, not necessarily smaller. Sometimes the shape of grief expands before it eases, not necessarily lighter. Sometimes it deepens before it becomes bearable, but different, always different. New angles appear, new dimensions open. What had been only absence sometimes begins also to hold the warmth of what was there, like a room that still holds, faintly, the smell of someone who has left it. Let us explore a story about this. There is a story sometimes told about a man who carried a great loss for many years. He had lost someone very dear to him early in his life, at an age when he was young and entirely unprepared for it, and the loss had shaped the landscape of everything that came after. He did not try to hide it. He did not pretend it wasn't there. He carried it openly, as one carries something that simply will not be put down. But he could not find any way to think about it that helped. It lived in him as a weight, steady, unchanged, year after year after year. When he was much older, he came to a woman who was known in her region for understanding such things, not because she was untouched by loss herself, but perhaps because of exactly the opposite. She had lost a great deal and had somehow found a way to keep living fully. He said to her, "I have carried this for so long. I don't know how to put it down. I have tried in every way I could think of. And yet, here it is, still the same." She said, "Tell me what it feels like right now." He described it. He used words like heavy and dark and ever present. He said it was like carrying a stone. She said, "And what does the stone feel like in your hand right now?" He was somewhat surprised by the specificity of the question. He thought about it carefully. He said, "Smooth, worn. It used to feel rough, I think, in the early years, but it has been held so long that it's smooth now." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said gently, "So it has changed." He looked at her. He said, "I suppose it has." She said, "And have you?" He sat with that for a long time. He had been so absorbed in the apparent unchangingness of the grief, so focused on the weight that never seemed to shift, that he had not noticed his own changing. His hands were different from the hands that had first held this stone. His eyes had seen more. His heart had been broken open by the loss and had, over the years, and without his realizing, quietly expanded. He was not the same person who had first picked up the stone, and neither, quite, was the stone. He wept a little when he understood this, not from sadness only, though the sadness was there, but from something that felt very much like relief. The relief of discovering that something you had believed to be frozen is in fact still moving, still becoming. That time has been doing its quiet work after all, even when you could not feel it working. What moves me in this story, what has always moved me in it, is that the man did not need to put the stone down. He only needed to look at it more clearly and see what it had actually become, not what it was on the first day when it was sharp and he was not yet shaped to carry it. What it is now, in these hands, in this life, after all this carrying. Perhaps your own grief is something like this. Perhaps if you were to look at it very carefully tonight, not to fix it, only to see it, you might find that it is not quite the same shape it was, that something in it has been worn smooth by time and by the particular way you have carried it, that you have become someone somewhat different from the person who first took it up. The stone is still there. The weight is still real. But change is happening, even when it cannot be felt directly, even when nothing seems to be moving. Something always is. Consider a small story that approaches this from the softest possible angle. There was a young woman who loved a particular season above all others. She anticipated it every year with a particular quality of longing, and when it arrived, she was wholly in it. She felt it in her whole body. She noticed every aspect of it with the attentiveness of someone who knows that something will not last. And she was grateful in a way that was visible to the people around her, and that made them a little more grateful too. And then the season ended, as it always does, and she felt the going of it acutely, every year, without fail. The ending of this season brought with it a particular melancholy, reliable as the season itself, as though the joy and the sadness were two parts of the same thing. When she was older, she spoke about this to a friend who had known her for many years, and the friend said something she had not expected. The friend said, "You know, I have always noticed that you experience that season more completely than anyone else I know, more fully in it than most people manage to be in anything. And I wonder if the melancholy you feel when it leaves is part of the same capacity, that you feel things fully, in and out, the fullness coming and the fullness going. They're the same quality, facing different directions." She sat with this for a while, and she realized that she had always, quietly, thought of the sadness at the season's end as a kind of failure, as if, had she loved it more wisely or held it more lightly, she would not feel so bereft when it went. But her friend was offering a different reading entirely. The depth of the sadness was not a flaw in the loving. It was the other face of it. Perhaps grief, in its most honest form, is always the other face of love. The same depth, the same particularity, pointing in a different direction. Rest for a moment. Let your breath be easy. Let the sounds outside, whatever they are, be simply the world continuing, doing its patient work of continuing, which it will do through the night whether you sleep or not. You are held by something larger than tonight, by the long quiet of the world. We will continue together. There is something that the mind does in grief that is worth looking at quietly and without judgment, because when we see it clearly, it loses some of its power. The mind has a habit, in grief especially, of building a story, not the honest story of the loss, which is painful but straightforward. A second story, built on top, about what the loss means, about what it says about you, about your particular luck, your particular life, the specific and personal way that things tend to go badly for you, specifically. This second story is the source of a great deal of additional suffering. The grief is hard enough. The story about the grief, the layer that makes it evidence of something, that makes it feel uniquely and personally directed at you, is harder still. And unlike the grief itself, the story is not quite real. It is something the mind adds very quickly, almost automatically, the way a person who stubs their toe immediately begins to be angry at the chair. The teachers were gentle about this. They did not say that the story making was foolish or that the person making it was doing anything wrong. They only pointed to it and said, "This is a second thing. The loss is one thing. The story about the loss is another. And perhaps, just for a moment, you can see them as separate. Let us explore a story about this. There is an old story that points to this, one that has been told in many forms across many traditions. It concerns a young potter who was, by any measure, exceptionally gifted. He had learned his craft from a master, and his work was already beginning to surpass what most potters achieve in a lifetime. He was proud of this, not in a vain way, but in the honest way of someone who has worked very hard and knows what the work has cost him. One afternoon, a pot he had spent many days on, perhaps his finest yet, certainly the finest he had made to that point, slipped from his hands and shattered on the stone floor of his workshop. He stood looking at the pieces for a long time, and then the second story began. He told himself that this was proof he was careless, that he did not deserve to make beautiful things, that whatever talent he had was a lie he had told himself, and this broken pot was the truth of it, that other potters would never have dropped it, that there was something wrong with him specifically that caused things like this to happen. By the time the second story was finished, he was not only grieving the pot, he was grieving himself. He went to his teacher that evening with all of this. He described the breaking of the pot and also, honestly, in great detail, everything the breaking had seemed to say about him. His teacher listened without interruption. When the young man finished, she said, "Tell me again what happened, just the facts, nothing else." He said, "I was carrying the pot. It slipped from my hands. It fell. It broke." She said, "Yes. And is that a different thing from everything else you told me?" He looked at her. He said, "I suppose it is." She said, "The pot broke. That is one thing. Everything you decided the pot breaking meant about you, that is a second thing. And the second thing is carrying a great deal of weight that the first thing never asked it to carry." He sat with this for a long time. The sadness about the pot remained. The pot was gone, and it had been beautiful, and that was a real loss. But the self-accusation, the particular quality of suffering that said, "This means something specific about me," that had been, he began to see, something he had added. The floor had not spoken to him. The pot had not been making a judgment. It had simply fallen, as pots sometimes do, and broken, as broken things do. When the second story loosened, just slightly, what remained was only the first story, which was honest and which was sad, but which was also, in a strange way, cleaner, simpler. The pot broke. I am sad about it. That is the whole thing. Perhaps you have a second story about your grief. Perhaps there is a layer of meaning that has been applied to the loss, a sense that it says something particular about your life, your worth, your luck, the specific and personal way that the world tends to work against you. This is understandable. The mind makes these stories automatically, as a way of trying to make sense of things. But the story is not the loss. And loosening the story, even just enough to see it as separate from the grief itself, can create the smallest, most useful breathing room. The grief is real. What does the grief feel like, stripped of the story? It probably feels like missing something, like the plain presence of absence, like the honest ache of having loved. And that, while genuinely painful, is also bearable. It is what it is. It does not carry any accusation. There is a second story here, a gentler one that approaches the same idea from another direction. There was a woman who lived by the sea and who, for many years, believed that the sea was angry at her. Every storm, every rough crossing, every loss connected to water, and she had known a few, felt to her like something directed, personal. The sea had something against her specifically. An old sailor who had worked those waters for decades heard her say this once and considered it thoughtfully. Then he said, "The sea doesn't know you exist. It just does what it does. On days when it is calm, it is not being kind to you. On days when it is rough, it is not being cruel. You are in its way on rough days. That's all. The sea has not made a story about you." She was quiet for a while. It had never occurred to her to think of it this way. The sea simply did what it did. The cruelty had been something she had added to the weather. He said, "And that might seem like it makes things worse, that even the sea doesn't know your name. But I've always found it makes things easier. The difficult things are not arranged against me. They just happen. And that means they have no particular opinion about whether I get through them. Which means I can simply get through them without needing to argue with the intention behind them. Perhaps the loss you are carrying was not arranged against you. Perhaps it simply happened, the way weather happens, the way pots sometimes slip, the way seasons turn regardless of whether we are ready. And if it was not arranged against you, then you do not need to defend yourself against it. You only need to live through it, which you are already doing. Let your breath be easy now. The chest rises, the chest falls. You are not required to have arrived at any understanding tonight. Only to breathe, only to rest. We will go on together. There is a quality that the old teachers talked about at great length, one that is sometimes translated into the word equanimity. Like impermanence, the word can feel remote when you meet it on the page, philosophical, something to be achieved by people with more patience or more practice than you currently have. But what the teachers actually meant by it was quite ordinary and quite beautiful. They meant something like the ability to stand in the rain without deciding that rain is a catastrophe. This is not numbness. It is not the pretense that the rain is not wet. Equanimity is feeling the rain fully, its coldness, its weight, the way it finds the gap at the collar and runs down the back. And not adding the extra layer of suffering that says, this rain is proof that things are fundamentally wrong, that life is arranged against me, that something has gone irretrievably and permanently wrong with the world. Grief, experienced with something approaching equanimity, does not become smaller. It becomes, in a strange way, more bearable, because the secondary suffering, the suffering about the suffering, the layer that says you should not be feeling this, you should be further along by now. Something is wrong with you for still being here. That layer can soften. And when it softens, what remains is only the grief itself, which is painful, genuinely painful, but which is also, in its own way, clean, the straightforward ache of having loved something that changed, without the additional weight of self-criticism and self-accusation. Let us explore a story about this. In a small monastery in the foothills, there was a cook who had worked in that kitchen for more than 40 years. She had fed students, teachers, travelers, and pilgrims. She had cooked in abundance and in scarcity, in summer heat and winter cold, in times of celebration and times of difficulty. She was known not for brilliance or for any particular quality of food, but for a quality of presence, a steadiness that made the kitchen feel like a safer place than it might otherwise have been. One spring, a young student was assigned to help her. This student had recently received some difficult news from home. A relationship had ended. Something she had loved and hoped for had collapsed, and she arrived in the kitchen on a particular morning clearly struggling. She was quiet when she would normally speak, slow when she was usually quick, and she dropped things twice before the morning was well underway. The cook did not say anything for a long time. She just continued working, and she worked in a way that somehow made the space feel calmer, less demanding, as if the kitchen itself had decided to ask less of everyone that morning. Eventually, the student said, more to herself than to the cook, "I feel like I can't do anything right. Everything is falling apart, and it keeps landing in here too." The cook said, "Yes, I've noticed you're having a hard time this morning." The student said, "Does it show that much?" The cook said, "It shows. That's all right. What you're feeling is real. You don't have to be different in my kitchen than you are." The student was quiet. Then she said, "I thought I was supposed to leave it at the door." The cook said, "Can you?" The student thought about it honestly. She said, "No, I don't think so." The cook said, "Of course not. Real things come in with you. That's how it is. But you can let it be here in the kitchen without letting it run the kitchen. You can feel it and still do the work. The work is simple. The carrots still need chopping. And sometimes the chopping helps. Not because it distracts you from the feeling, but because it gives the feeling something to be alongside, something steady, the feeling and the work, side by side." The student began to chop the carrots, and as she worked, she realized that the cook had not asked her to feel less. She had not offered comfort in the sense of making the thing smaller. She had only offered something to be alongside the feeling, the simple, ordinary, manageable work of the morning. And something in the plain forward motion of that work held her in a way that nothing else had managed to that day. Equanimity is perhaps this, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something steady alongside the feeling. Something that continues, something that does not require the grief to finish before it can begin. There is a second story that belongs alongside this one. Consider a small story about two old friends who had walked the same road since they were children. They had known each other through many seasons, easy ones and very hard ones. And they had arrived together at a late part of life with a long shared history behind them. One of them had experienced a considerable amount of loss over the years, more, perhaps, than seemed fair, and people who knew both of them often marveled at this person's steadiness. Not the absence of grief. This person had grieved, and deeply, but the quality of remaining present and even, at times at peace, in the midst of a life that had contained real difficulty. Once, the other friend asked, "How do you remain so steady? What is the practice? What do you do?" The first friend was quiet for a while, then said, "I think the main thing I learned is to stop trying to be somewhere other than where I am. When the grief is here, I am here with it. I don't try to reason my way out of it or rush it toward being finished. And when something pleasant is here, a good morning, a bird, a conversation I enjoyed, I let myself be in that too, without guilt. I stopped trying to arrange my feelings into an order that made more sense. They come when they come. I am here when they come. That's the practice, I think. Just being here for what is actually here. The other friend said, "That sounds very simple." The first friend said, "It is. It is also somehow one of the most difficult things I've ever done. But simple, yes. This is equanimity, not elevation above the weather, simply being here for the weather that comes, fully and without fighting it, and trusting that the sky is still there above it. Soften the place behind your eyes now, if you are willing. Notice your hands, where they are, what they feel, whether they are open or closed. You do not have to arrange them into any position. Just notice them. They're with you in the dark. You are here. The grief is here. The night is here. All of it, simply here. We will continue in a moment. One of the most remarkable things in the old teachings on impermanence is that they were not, at their heart, teachings about loss. They were teachings about freedom. This is a paradox, and like all paradoxes, it takes a moment to settle before it begins to make sense. The teachers noticed something about suffering. They noticed that a great deal of it came not from what was actually happening, but from the mind's refusal to allow things to change. The grasping, the holding on, the desperate insistence that things remain as they were, was itself the source of tremendous additional pain. And they asked, what if we could learn to hold things without the grip? What if we could love deeply and fully with our whole hearts, and at the same time hold that love with open hands? Not loose hands, not indifferent hands, open hands. This is not a teaching against love. It is almost the opposite, because the teachers also noticed that when we love with open hands, when we allow the things we love their full nature, including their nature, to change and eventually to leave, we love them more honestly. We love what they actually are, rather than what we need them to be in order to feel safe. And perhaps the same is true of the past itself. The seasons of our lives, the people, the versions of ourselves we once were, they too deserve to be held with open hands, to be honored fully for what they were, without diminishment, and then allowed to become what they are becoming, which is something we cannot control, and perhaps something we were never meant to. Let us explore a story about this. There is a story sometimes told about two old friends who had grown up together, studied together, gone different ways in the world, and come back to the same region in their later years. They were both thoughtful people who had known considerable loss, and they would sometimes sit together in the evenings and talk honestly about what they had learned. One of them said, "The hardest thing I've had to learn is to open my hands. I used to hold everything so tightly. Every good thing that came to me I gripped. Every difficult thing I pushed against with all my strength. And the gripping and the pushing took most of my energy. There was not very much of me left over for anything else." The other said, "What changed it?" The first said, "A teacher once showed me my own hands while I was talking about something I was afraid to lose. I had not noticed that my hands had clenched into fists. She simply pointed at them, and I looked at them and realized I had been walking around like that, tightly fisted, for years. Not because fists were useful, but because I had never thought to unclench them." The other said, "And did unclenching them help?" The first said, "It felt like losing something at first. It felt like giving something up, like being careless. But slowly, I began to understand the difference between holding something and gripping it. You can hold things very gently, and still hold them. The love doesn't go away when the grip loosens. If anything, it becomes cleaner, more honest, because you are loving the thing itself, not loving your need to keep it. Perhaps tonight you are holding something very tightly. Perhaps the grief itself is something being held tightly, the shape of the loss, the particular quality of it, the specific ache of it, because in some way, holding it tightly feels like keeping something, like staying close to what was loved. And this is understandable. The holding is a form of love. But the open hand can hold as much as the closed fist, and it is far less painful to walk with. There is a second story that belongs with this one. A grandmother who lived near the sea had a habit that her grandchildren noticed and eventually asked her about. Whenever she walked on the beach, she would pick up a stone. She would hold it in her hand for a while, feel its weight and texture, turn it in her fingers, hold it to the light if the light was interesting, and then she would set it back down. One grandchild, a child who thought about things carefully, said, "Why do you always put them down? Why don't you keep any of them?" She said, "If I kept them all, I would be carrying a very heavy sack, and I would stop being able to feel the ones I was holding now, and I would miss whatever stone was coming next." The child said, "But what if one of them is really special? What if one of them is the most beautiful stone you will ever find?" The grandmother said, "Then I hold it for a long time. I really feel it. I don't rush. And then I set it down, because the feeling of it, that stays. You can set down the stone without setting down the feeling of it. Those are two different things. The feeling stays. The stone can be set down, and the feeling stays. Perhaps this is what the old teaching of open hands is really saying. Not that you let go of what you have loved. Not that you release the feeling or erase the memory or stop caring. But that you allow the stone itself, the person, the season, the version of life that was, to be set down gently when the time comes, and to rest there while the feeling, which was always yours, remains in your hands. Let your hands rest now wherever they are, perhaps a little less tightly than they were before, just a small uncurling, just a small invitation toward the open. We will continue in a moment. There is something in the old teachings on grief that can, when you first encounter it, seem almost counterintuitive. It is the idea that grief, fully entered into, can become a teacher. Not that we should be grateful for the loss. No teacher worth their salt would say that. But that the experience of loss, if it is met rather than avoided, has a way of opening things in us that were previously closed, of revealing something about the nature of love and of life that was always there but not yet visible. The teachers talked often about the heart that has been broken, not in the casual way we sometimes use that phrase, but literally, a heart that has been cracked open by grief, by love's loss, by the particular pain of caring deeply for something that changed or left or ended. And what they noticed about such a heart was not primarily its damage. What they noticed was its new capacity. A broken open heart has a room in it that a defended, protected heart does not. It has been through something, and the going through has made it, in some ways, more spacious. This is not a consolation prize. It is not someone saying, "Be grateful for the pain, because it made you better." It is simply an observation about what the teachers had seen over and over in the people who had grieved deeply and allowed themselves to fully inhabit that grief. Something opened. Something became capable. The capacity for compassion, for presence with others' pain, for genuine understanding rather than perform sympathy. These things tend to deepen in people who have genuinely suffered. Not always, but often, in its own quiet, unmistakable way. Let us explore a story about this. There is a story sometimes told about two students who trained together under the same teacher for many years. They were both gifted. They were also different in temperament. One was quick and sharp and brilliant. The other was slow and steady and thorough. They studied side by side. They argued ideas with each other. They helped each other through the difficulties of the practice. And eventually, they both went out into the world to teach and to live their own lives. The quick, brilliant student had a life that was, in many ways, remarkable. His mind remained extraordinary. His students loved him. But as the years went on, some of the people who knew him closely noticed a particular quality in his work. It was technically perfect, but somehow sealed. As if the brilliance had a finish on it that prevented anything from landing very deep. He was gifted, but he was, in some essential way, unbroken. And the unbrokenness was visible. The slow, steady student had a different kind of life. He experienced considerable loss, the loss of a partner, the loss of a child, seasons of illness and difficulty that the other student did not encounter. And he grieved each of these things in his own thorough way, going through them rather than around them. He came out the other side different from how he had entered, not diminished, different. In his later years, people came to him from all over the region, not because he was brilliant, though he was thoughtful, but because of something in the quality of his presence. When you sat with him and told him something difficult, you felt known. You felt that he had been somewhere similar, that he was not hearing your difficulty from a safe, untouched distance, but from somewhere nearby, somewhere that recognized it. When people asked him what had shaped him most, he would say, "The losses," not as a recommendation, simply as a truth. The losses opened me in places I did not know were closed. There is a second story that I want to put beside this one, a gentler one about the opening that happens over time. Consider a small story about a woman who spent her life making pots. She had learned the craft from her grandmother and had practiced it for more than 5 decades. And over those decades, her work changed. In the early years, her pots were technically good, well-formed, even, clean. In the middle years, something shifted. She had been through difficulty by then, real difficulty, and something in that experience had found its way into the work. Her pots began to have a quality that other potters noticed and could not quite explain, a kind of warmth, a kind of presence, as if the clay had been shaped by hands that had held hard things. She could not explain it herself when asked. She would only say, "I used to try to make things that had no flaws. Now I try to make things that are honest. And I think I only learned what honest meant after things had been difficult." An old teacher of hers, hearing this, said, "The fires we go through do not only damage. Sometimes they change the clay in ways that make it stronger and truer. Not because fire is good, but because clay that has been through fire is different from clay that has only been on the shelf. You are clay that has been through fire. That is not a romantic idea. It is a description of something that has happened and that has been genuinely difficult. But perhaps, somewhere in the difficulty, something is becoming truer in you, something more honest, more capacious, more capable of the kind of presence that only comes from having been in the particular place you have been. You do not have to be grateful for it. You do not have to find the silver lining tonight. But perhaps you can let the possibility rest here, lightly, without forcing anything, that what you have been through has not only taken something, it has also, in ways you may not yet be able to see, given something. Let the breath come easily now. Notice the rise of the chest, the fall, the simple, faithful work of the body continuing through the night. You have been somewhere hard. You are here. That is real. We will continue. There is something that the old teachings rarely name directly, but that everyone who has grieved knows intimately. It is the way that grief lives in the body, not only in the mind, not only in the emotions, but physically, in the chest that feels heavier than it should, in the shoulders that carry a weight no one can see, in the stomach that is never quite settled, in the throat that tightens unexpectedly at a sound or a smell or a particular angle of afternoon light. The teachers understood this. They understood that the human being is not divided into body and mind and feeling, that these are not separate compartments, but one continuous thing, and that what touches the heart touches the body too, and what soothes the body can reach back upward and offer something to the heart. And so, one of the quietest teachings is simply this. In grief, be kind to the body, not as a cure, not as a solution, but as a form of care. The body that is carrying grief is working harder than it looks like it is working. It deserves gentleness. Let us explore a story about this. Long ago, in a village near a wide river, there was an old herbalist who was known in the surrounding region for her ability to help people who were grieving. People traveled long distances to see her, expecting perhaps some formula or treatment, some specific thing to be done. What they found instead was often quite simple. She would ask them to sit. She would bring them something warm to hold in their hands. She would ask them to feel the warmth of the cup, not to think about it or analyze it, just to feel it, that specific physical warmth moving from the ceramic into the palms. And she would say, "Tell me where you feel the grief in your body," not in words about feelings, in the body itself. "Where does it live today?" People would point, the chest, the throat, the back of the neck, the hollow of the stomach. She would listen, and she would nod, and she would not try to remove it from those places. She would say, "Thank your body for holding it. Your body has been carrying this for you." And something about that instruction, to thank the body, was often unexpectedly moving, because the body had been carrying it, quietly, faithfully, without complaint. The chest had been heavy for weeks or months, and had simply continued to carry the weight, without asking to be relieved of it. She would say, "You cannot think your way out of the body's grief, but you can be kind to the body while it carries it. You can give it warmth and rest and the small physical kindnesses, the slow breath, the unclenched jaw, the shoulders allowed to drop. These things do not cure grief, but they are a form of care. And care, in the middle of hard things, is not nothing. Care is what makes the hard things survivable. Soften your jaw now, if it has held. Unclench the hands. Feel the warmth of being here, the warmth of breath, the warmth of the blanket, the warmth of the bed that has been waiting for you all day to lie down in it and rest. The body is your companion through this. It has been doing its patient work every day of the grief, carrying what needed to be carried. Be kind to it tonight." Consider also a second story. There was a weaver in a mountain village who had grieved a very long time. She had carried her loss for years and had continued to work through it, weaving long days in her workshop, the rhythmic motion of the shuttle passing through, the pattern building thread by thread. And people who visited her workshop in those years would sometimes say, there is something in the cloth you make now, something that was not there before. She knew what they meant, though she could not always explain it. She had learned through grief to feel her body differently. She had learned to work from the body rather than fighting the body. The grief had made her slower. She could not hurry the way she once had, and in the slowing she had discovered something she had not known before, the particular quality of attention that the body has access to when the mind is not racing ahead of it, a kind of wisdom that lives in the hands, a knowing in the shoulders and the breath. She said once to a student who asked her how she worked, "I have learned to listen to my hands. They know things my mind does not. When I was young, I thought the meander had all the answers. Now I think the hands know more than they are given credit for. The body knows things. The body knows things. It knows how to carry grief, even when the mind cannot figure it out. It knows how to keep going. It knows how to rest if you let it. It knows even now, as you lie here, how to settle toward sleep. Trust it. It has done this every night of your life. It knows the way. Let the body be completely given over to the bed now. Every point of contact, the head, the spine, the arms, the legs, simply resting, simply placed. The body doing what the body does when you finally let it, moving in its own slow, faithful way toward rest. There is a particular nighttime quality to grief that is worth naming, because it is so common and so often makes the person experiencing it feel that something is uniquely wrong with them. During the day, there is movement and action and the requirement of attention, and these things provide a kind of structure that holds grief at a certain distance. Not gone, present, but managed, kept to its own corner of the room. And then the day ends. The busyness stops. The body lies down. And in that stillness, the grief fills the available space. This is not a sign that the grief is worse than you thought. It is simply the nature of what happens when the structure falls away. The grief does not grow at night. It becomes more visible at night, because the things that were obscuring it during the day are no longer there. This is important to understand because the mind at night tends to interpret the fullness of the grief as evidence of something alarming, as though the nighttime feeling is the true feeling, the daytime one a lie, but neither is truer than the other. They are the same thing in different conditions, the way a lamp seems brighter in a dark room than in full daylight. You are allowed to have a hard night. You are allowed to lie here and feel it fully. This is not a mistake. This is not a failure of any technique. This is simply what grief looks like when the room is quiet enough to hear it. Let us explore a story about this. Long ago, in a small house at the edge of a quiet town, there lived a woman who was known among her neighbors for her wisdom about sleep. Not sleep medicine, nothing so formal. Simply the wisdom of having lived long and having paid attention to how nights work. People would come to her when they could not sleep, and she would sit with them for a while and ask them questions. And often the sitting and the questions were enough to help. One night, a young man came to her in considerable distress. He said, "I cannot sleep, and every night I cannot sleep, the grief gets worse. I think sleep would help me, but I cannot sleep because of the grief, and then the grief gets worse because I haven't slept. It's a circle with no way in." She asked him, "What does the grief feel like right now, at this moment?" He described it. He was thorough and honest. She said, "And what does it feel like during the day?" He said, "Smaller. Present, but smaller. I can carry it during the day." She said, "So the grief is the same grief, but at night it takes up more of the room." He said, "Yes, that was exactly it. She said, "The grief is not growing. The room is growing. At night, when the day falls away, you have more room inside you, more quiet, more stillness, and the grief, which was always there, now has room to be fully itself. This is not the grief getting worse. This is the grief being seen." He was quiet for a while, then said, "That's a strange way to think about it." She said, "Perhaps, but if the nighttime grief is not the grief growing, but only the grief becoming visible, then you are not going backwards. You are simply in the part of the day when you can see what is true, and what is true is bearable. What is true can be held. You have been holding it all day, and tonight you can hold it here in the quiet without needing it to be smaller than it is." He did not sleep immediately, but something in him eased. The alarm about the grief, the secondary layer of fear about the feeling, softened, and in that softening there was a little more room, not for the grief to leave, just for him to be in the same room with it without panicking. Perhaps that is available to you tonight. The grief is not growing in the dark. It is simply visible in the dark. You are in the part of the day when you can see what is true, and what is true is bearable. You have already shown that it is bearable by bearing it. Tonight is no different. There is a second story here, a smaller one, about the night itself. There was an old gardener who had tended his garden through many decades and many weathers. He knew, in the deep practical way that comes only from long attention, that some things in a garden only happen at night. Certain flowers open only in the dark. Certain roots grow only in the cool quiet after the sun has set. The night is not the enemy of the garden. It is the other half of what makes the garden work. He would say sometimes, people think the night is when nothing happens, but the night is when some of the most important things happen. Quietly, underground, out of sight. The garden is working in the dark as much as in the light, just differently. Perhaps the night you are in right now, this difficult night, this sleepless night, this night full of grief and weight, is also, quietly, the night when something is working in you. Not dramatically, not in a way you can see or feel. Underground, in the quiet, the way roots grow in the dark. You do not have to make it happen. It is happening. The night is doing its work. Let it. Soften your face now. Let the jaw be easy. Feel the particular quiet of this hour, the way the world has set aside some of its noise and given you this. You are held by the night as much as you are troubled by it. Let both things be true. We will go on. One of the most quietly radical things in the old teachings on grief and impermanence is the instruction to be here. Just here, not ahead, where the grief might be different or gone or resolved. Not behind, in the place where the loss happened, replaying and reworking. Here, this breath, this body, this moment. This instruction sounds simple and is, in fact, extraordinarily difficult for a grieving mind to follow, because the grieving mind naturally migrates. It goes toward the past, replaying, re-examining, asking what might have been different. Or it goes toward the future, projecting, anticipating, already living in the shape of a loss not yet finished. It goes everywhere except the only place that is actually available, which is here. But the teachers notice something particular about the present moment that makes it different from both the past and the future. The present moment is always, without exception, bearable, even when it contains pain, even when it contains grief. The present moment itself, just this breath, just this heartbeat, just this, is survivable. It is the mind's projection into the future that creates the additional dread. The thought, I will always feel this way. The thought, I don't know how I will get through this. These thoughts do not live in the present. They live in an imagined future that has not yet arrived and may not arrive in the form imagined. What is here right now? The weight of the body against the bed, the sounds around you, whatever they are, the simple, faithful fact of breath. These things are here. They are real. And they are, in their own plain and undemanding way, manageable. Let us explore a story about this. Long ago, in a quiet town between two gentle hills, there lived a woman who was known among her neighbors for a quality of practical wisdom. Not wisdom about large philosophical matters, just the wisdom of long attention, of having noticed things carefully over many years. People would come to her sometimes in the middle of great difficulties, and she would make tea, and they would sit together, and she would ask them questions that were somehow useful. She always asked the same opening question. She would say, "Are you all right now? Not tomorrow, not last week, not in the situation you're describing. Right now, in this chair, in this room, with this tea." And most people, when they sat with that question honestly, when they set aside the future and the past and the story about the situation, would say, "Yes. Right now, in this chair, I am all right." And she would say, "Then let us stay here a little while." It sounds almost too small to help. But the people who had sat with her reported that something changed when she asked that question. Not because the difficulty disappeared, not because the grief lifted, not because anything resolved, but because for a moment they were brought out of the imagined future and the replayed past and placed gently, exactly here. And here was bearable. Here was, in fact, fine. One man who had lost his wife and who had been coming to see this woman every few weeks in the months afterwards said to her once, "When I am here with you, it is bearable, and when I leave, it stops being bearable." She said, "Is that true? Or is it that when you are here, and when you leave, your mind goes ahead of you to all the places you are afraid of?" He sat with that. Then he said, "I think when I leave, I start living in a week from now, or a month." She said, "Then practice living in the hour you are in, just the hour. The hour is almost always manageable, just the hour, just this breath, just this moment. You do not have to survive the whole of it tonight. You only have to be here in this specific moment, which is this, and this is already here. And it is already, in its own way, quiet enough." There is a second story here, a very small one. Consider a small story about a child who had climbed a very tall tree and had become frightened of coming down. He looked at the ground far below and could not make himself move. A neighbor who had watched him climb called up from the ground, "Don't look at the ground. Look at the branch below you. Just that branch, the next branch, just that." And the child looked at the branch just below him, and it did not seem so far away, and he moved to it. And then there was another branch, just that branch, and then another. He came down, eventually, one branch at a time, never looking at the ground. And when he reached it, he was surprised at how fast the coming down had seemed once he stopped trying to see Kompo all the way to the bottom. Just the next branch, just the next breath, just the next hour. This is not avoidance. It is the most honest possible way of being in something difficult. One manageable piece at a time, without requiring the whole of it to be visible at once. You do not need to see the ground tonight. You only need the branch you are on right now, which is this moment, which is breath, which is the dark and the quiet, and the body slowly releasing into rest. Take a slow breath now, easy and unhurried. Feel the chest rise and settle. Notice the particular quiet of this hour. Not a demanding quiet, not an empty quiet, but a spacious one. Room to breathe, room to be exactly as you are. We will go on together. There is an idea in the old teachings that I want to bring to you gently, because it can be misunderstood, and I want to offer it in the way it was meant. It is the idea that the self, the sense of I, the particular person who has been hurt, who is grieving, who is carrying the weight, is perhaps not quite as fixed and separate as it usually feels. This does not mean that you do not exist, or that your pain is not real, or that the loss you have suffered was not a genuine loss. It means something much more tender than that. It means that the teachers noticed, when people were suffering most acutely, that a large part of the suffering had to do with the story of the self, the narrative of me, this particular person, with this particular luck, in this particular situation that is happening to me specifically. And they noticed that when that story loosened, even slightly, when a person could feel, for a moment, their connection to the vast and ancient human experience of loss, rather than their isolation inside their own private version of it, something shifted. Not the grief, but the loneliness of the grief, because what you are carrying tonight is not private. It is old. It is shared. Every person who has ever lived has known some version of this. The loss of someone loved, the ending of something that mattered, the particular loneliness of lying awake with something that the night will not take away. You are not alone in this room, even though it feels that way. You're in the company of every human being who has ever lain awake with grief. And that is a very old and very large company. Let us explore a story about this. There is an old story that points to this, one of the most well-known in the long tradition of teachings about grief. It concerns a woman who came to a teacher carrying her grief in the most literal sense. She carried her young child who had died, not able to accept the death, going from door to door asking for medicine to bring the child back. She had been to many people, and no one had been able to help her, and she came to this teacher in the fullness of her grief and her desperation. The teacher received her with great gentleness. He did not argue with her about what was possible or impossible. He said, "I can help you. But first, I need one thing. Bring me a small amount of mustard seed from a home that has never known death." She went. She went to the first house she came to and asked. They had the mustard seed, they said, but their grandmother had died in this house just last year. She went to the next house. Their son had died many years ago. She went to the next. Their father, their mother, their child. She went from door to door through the entire village, and at each door she heard another story. At each door, another loss, another grief as real and deep as her own. By the time she returned to the teacher, empty-handed, something had changed in her. Not that the grief was gone. Nothing had touched the enormity of what she had lost. But she had moved, through the afternoon of her walking and asking, from the isolation of her private grief into the vast shared ocean of human grief. She had been, unknowingly, in a room full of people who understood. And that understanding, that communion of loss, had given her something to hold on to that she had not had before. She returned to the teacher and did not need to say anything. He received her quietly, and he sat with her in the grief that was now shared, even though none of the individual losses had been erased. Perhaps you can feel something of what she felt in the walking from door to door, the recognition in each face, the ordinary miracle of discovering that you are not uniquely cursed, but universally accompanied, that the grief you carry, which feels so isolating and so specific, is also one strand in the longest fabric humanity has ever woven. There is a second story here, a very small one, that stays with me. Consider a small story about a group of travelers who happened to share a resting place one night on a long road. They were going different directions and had nothing much in common, and at first they sat separately, eating their separate meals in the light of the fire, not speaking. And then one of them, an old woman traveling alone, said simply, "It's a hard time of year for me. My husband died this season, many years ago," and without quite meaning to, a conversation began. One by one, they shared something of their own losses, quietly, without drama, just the plain facts of what had been hard. And by the end of the evening, these strangers who had had nothing in common had something. Not friendship exactly, but something. The fire between them, and the shared knowledge of having carried difficult things. They parted in the morning and probably never saw each other again. But several of them, in the years that followed, would sometimes think of that night, the fire, the unexpected company, the strange comfort of discovering that the road was not as empty as it had looked. You are not traveling an empty road. There are others here in the dark, carrying what they carry. The road is full of people who have been where you are. You are accompanied, even in the silence. Even in this particular hour, the company is real, even if invisible. Take a breath. Let it be slow. Notice the room around you, the particular stillness of this night in this place. You are here, and you are not alone in being here. The whole long human story of grief is here with you tonight, lightly, as company. Rest in that. There is something that happens in grief that not enough people name, and because it goes unnamed, it can become its own source of suffering. It is the way that grief arrives in waves, not steadily, not in a straight line toward resolution, but in the strange circular way that the sea moves, retreating and returning, sometimes without warning. You might have a day that feels more manageable, a morning where the weight seems slightly less, and then, without anything happening, without any particular reason, the grief is back, full and immediate and unchanged, as though nothing had shifted at all. And the mind interprets this return as failure, as going backward, as proof that the grief will never be any different. But this is not failure. This is how grief actually moves. This is its true nature. Not a straight path, but a winding one. Not a river flowing always forward, but a tide, retreating and returning, and with each cycle moving, imperceptibly, in some overall direction. The teachers who had observed this over long years said, "Do not mistake a wave returning for the sea, not moving. The wave comes back, but the shoreline is not the same. Even though it looks the same from where you are standing, it is always being slowly, gradually, imperceptibly shaped." Let us explore a story about this. There is a story sometimes told about a woman who lived for many years near a large, slow river. The river was the great constant of her life. She had grown up beside it. She had raised her family near it. She knew its moods and its rhythms better than she knew almost anything else. And she had noticed, over decades of watching, something that visitors to the river rarely had the time to see. The river moved in cycles. There were weeks when it ran clear and fast, and weeks when it ran slow and thick, and weeks when it seemed almost still, and weeks when it flooded its banks and changed the color of the surrounding fields. The cycle was not predictable in its exact timing, but it was predictable in its nature. The river always moved, even when it seemed to be going backward, when the winter melt made it run contrary to its usual course in certain channels. It was still moving within its own nature. She sometimes spoke about this to people who were going through difficult things. She would say, "I have watched this river for 50 years, and I have never once seen it fail to move. Not once. Even when it looked completely still, it was moving, quietly, deep underneath, where you can't easily see. And even when it seemed to go backward, it was moving within the pattern of the season. You cannot always see the movement when you are inside it, but it is always there. Grief is like that river. You cannot always see the movement when you're inside it, but the movement is there. The tide coming back does not mean the tide is not also slowly receding overall. Both things are true. The wave returns, and also the shore is being shaped. There is a second story here, one that is perhaps softer. Consider a small story about a grandmother who was known in her family for a particular quality of calm. She had not always been calm. Her grandchildren would learn this eventually from stories others told. But she had arrived at something like calm over many years and many difficulties. One of her grandchildren was going through a hard time and came to her crying, saying, "I thought I was getting better, and then today it was as bad as the beginning. How can that be? How can I go backward like that?" The grandmother sat beside her and put an arm around her and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You know, when I was learning to make bread, really learning, not just following a recipe, but understanding the bread, I would sometimes have a perfect loaf, and I would think I had it figured out. And then the next day, I would make something that was terrible, and I would think I had lost it. But I hadn't lost it. I just hadn't made it part of myself yet. The good loaves and the bad loaves are all part of the same learning. And the bad loaves after a good loaf are not going backward. They're just the next part of the learning." The grandchild wiped her eyes. She said, "So the bad days are still part of it?" The grandmother said, "They are especially part of it. The bad days show you where you still need gentleness, where you're still learning. They are not undoing the good days. They are part of the same story. You have not gone backward when the wave returns. You are in the same story you have been in all along. And the story is moving, always moving. Even now, even in this difficult night, the story is moving. Rest your hands now, wherever they lie. Feel their weight. These hands have carried things. They know how to carry things. And they also know how to rest. Let them rest now. Let everything rest. We will go on. There is one more teaching I want to offer you before we begin to gather things together and move toward rest. It is perhaps the most personal of all the teachings and the most difficult to put into words, which is probably why the old teachers told stories about it, rather than trying to explain it. It is the idea that love does not end, that what we have loved, truly, deeply loved, becomes part of us in a way that loss cannot entirely reach. This is not a supernatural claim. It is an observation about how human beings actually work. The people who have loved us, the places that have shaped us, the seasons of our lives that mattered most. These things do not leave us when they leave. They continue, changed in form but present in substance, in the way we see and feel and move through the world. the way a child carries the gestures of a parent without realizing it, the way a place we grew up in lives in the particular quality of light we feel most at home in, the way someone we have loved deeply continues, in the smallest moments, to be the standard by which we recognize what love feels like. This is not grief's consolation prize. It is not the same as having the thing, but it is real. And sometimes, in the middle of loss, it is worth pausing to feel for a moment that what was loved has not entirely gone. It has become something different. It has become part of the fabric of who you are. Let us explore a story about this. There is a story sometimes told about a man who, in his old age, was known for an extraordinary quality of warmth. People who met him felt, without being able to explain it, that they were seen and welcomed. The quality was unmistakable and somewhat unusual, and occasionally people would ask him where it came from. He would say, and he would say it simply without sentiment, "It came from my mother. She had that quality. She saw people. She made everyone feel that coming into the room was the right thing to do. I watched her do this all through my childhood, and when she died, I was afraid I would lose it, as if it was something she owned and had only lent to me. But gradually I realized that it had become mine, not a copy of hers, something I had absorbed and made part of myself through all those years of watching. She was gone, but that quality of hers, the seeing, the welcoming, was living on in me." He paused, then said, "I suppose that is what love does, over enough time. It makes itself at home in the person who receives it, and then it cannot be removed without removing the person. Perhaps there is something like this for you, something that was given to you by the person or the place or the time that you have lost, that has become so much a part of you that it cannot be separated from you now. Not as a substitute for what is gone, but as evidence that what was loved did not only pass through, it settled, it stayed in you." There is a second story here, a gentler one. Consider a small story about an old musician who had lost many years before, a teacher who had shaped everything about the way she played. The loss had been profound, and for a long time after, she had struggled to play, not because she had lost the skill, but because every note felt like it belonged to the teacher, and playing the notes felt like using something that was no longer hers to use. She spoke about this once to a friend who was also a musician. The friend listened and then said, "When you play, whose hands are those?" She said, "Mine." The friend said, "And who taught those hands?" She said, "My teacher." The friend said, "Then your teacher plays when you play, not instead of you, alongside you. You are both there every time you sit down." The teaching didn't stop when the teacher died. It went on living in you. You carry it forward. She wept a little at this, not from sadness only, though the sadness was there, but from something like recognition. The teacher was in the music. The music was in her. The line between them was not as severed as it had seemed. What has been given to you is in you now. Whatever has shaped you, whoever has loved you, whatever seasons have passed through your life and left their particular mark, all of it is here in you, in the way you breathe and think and feel and move. The loss changed the form of it, but not the presence of it. This is perhaps the most honest comfort the teachers ever offered about grief. Not that the loss is not real, not that the absence is not genuine, but that the thing itself, the love, the shaping, the particular quality of what was there, has not entirely gone anywhere. It has only changed address, and the new address is you. Take a breath now and feel, if you are willing, one small thing in you that came from what you have lost. Not to analyze it or make it into something, only to notice that it is there, that it lives in you, that you are, in some small way, a continuation of what you grieve. Rest in that for a moment. We are almost at the gathering. We are almost at the closing. There is not much further to go. There is something else I want to offer you tonight. Something quieter than most of what we have talked about. It is the old idea of simply being a witness to your own experience, not analyzing it, not fixing it, not reaching conclusions about it. Just watching it with the same patient attention you might give to clouds moving across a wide sky. There is something in you that watches, something that has been watching all evening, watching the thoughts, watching the feelings, watching the grief as it rises and settles and rises again. This watching is not the grief. The grief is what is watched. The watcher is something else, something quieter, something steadier, something that does not require the grief to be any different in order to remain present and unhurt. The teachers talked about this quality by many names: the witness, the awareness, the still point, the deep quiet. The names do not matter as much as the recognition. There is something in you that is watching all of this, and that watcher is not broken by what it watches. It never has been. It never will be. When you lie here in the dark, full of feeling, perhaps you can allow your attention to rest for just a breath or two, not on what is being felt, but on the one who is feeling it. Not the weather, but the sky. Not the river, but the bank that holds it. That quiet, steady, watching part of you that is always here, always present, always unhurt and unhurried, regardless of what the feelings are doing. You are larger than what you are feeling tonight. You have always been larger. The grief is real, and it is present, and it is genuinely what it is. But it has never been all of you. You have never been only this. There is always more of you than the feeling that is loudest in the moment. Let us explore a story about this. Long ago, in a small monastery built into the side of a hill, there was an old teacher who was nearing the end of her life. She had been ill for some time, and her students, who loved her, and who were themselves learning, through her dying, something about the nature of things, would come to sit with her in her room. One afternoon, a young student sat beside her and noticed that the teacher seemed very peaceful. Not resigned, peaceful. There was something in her face that was not the absence of difficulty, but somehow the presence of something alongside the difficulty. The student asked, "Teacher, are you afraid?" The old woman thought about this honestly, as she thought about everything. Then she said, "There is part of me that is afraid. Yes, the part of me that does not want to leave, that loves the morning and the sound of rain and the people here. That part is frightened." The student said, "And is that very hard?" She said, "It is. And there is another part of me that is not frightened at all. Something that watches even the fear with a kind of quiet. Something that has always been here, watching everything, not frightened by any of it. And when I rest in that part, the fear is still there. But it is not all there is. There is also this watching, this stillness, this part that is not in the situation in the same way." The student didn't fully understand yet, but the teacher's face gave him something to return to over the years. The image of the watching part, the still part, the part that is always larger than what it watches. You have that part too. It is there right now. It is the part that is listening to these words, noticing the darkness, noticing the feeling in the chest, noticing the breath. It is the part that does not panic, even when everything else does. It is quieter than the grief, but it is there, and it is real, and it is yours. There is a second story here, a very small one that has always seemed to me to point at this from an unexpected direction. Consider a small story about a child who was afraid of storms. Every time the lightning came and the thunder shook the house, the child would come and climb into bed beside his grandmother, and she would hold him until the storm passed. One night, in the middle of a particularly loud storm, he asked her, "Are you ever afraid of storms?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "When I was young, I was. But I learned something a long time ago that helped. I learned that I am not the one in the storm. The storm is outside. I am inside. And the inside is where I live." He said, "But what if the inside and the outside are both scary?" She said, "Then you go further inside. There is always a further inside. There is always a place that is quieter than the place you are in. And when you get very good at finding it, you discover that it's always been there, in every storm, waiting, the further inside, the quieter place, the part that watches without being swept. This is available to you right now, in the dark. You do not have to find it by effort. You only have to become very still as you can manage, and notice that something in you is already still, that something has been still all along. Let the body be heavy. Let the breath be slow. Notice the stillness that is here, underneath the feeling. Not instead of the feeling, but underneath. The quiet floor. You can rest on it. It will hold you. There is something I want to say about patience. Not the kind of patience that is really just gritted teeth waiting for something to be over, but the kind of patience that the old teachers valued, a quality of settledness with the present moment, whatever the present moment contains, a willingness to be here in this for as long as this takes. The old word for this kind of patience, in some translations, is closer to endurance, but not endurance as force. Endurance as the river endures, not by fighting the banks, but by simply continuing to flow. The river does not force itself toward the sea. It follows the path that is available and continues. Grief asks something similar of us, not forcing, not fighting, not arriving at resolution by sheer will, but continuing, simply continuing to be here, to live the ordinary life alongside the grief, to chop the carrots and notice the morning light, and feel the weight of the blanket at night, and breathe and sleep and wake again. The continuing is the practice. The continuing is the patience. And in the continuing, without our doing anything in particular to cause it, things change. Let us explore a story about this. Long ago, in a valley that opened toward the sea, there was a farmer who had tended his land for decades and who was known for an unusual quality of patience. Not the passive kind. He worked very hard, and he was attentive and skilled, but he had a quality of not hurrying the things that could not be hurried. He did not try to make the seeds come up faster than they came. He did not worry at the soil when it was doing what soil does in its own time. He planted and he tended, and he trusted the process that he could not control. A young farmer came to him once and said, "How do you remain so calm when so much of it is out of your hands? When you have done everything right, and then you simply have to wait and hope?" The old farmer said, "I did not start out calm. I spent many years trying to hurry things, pulling at the plants to make them grow faster, worrying at the soil. Nothing grew any better for it, and I was very tired. And then one spring, I was too ill to do any of the extra things I usually did. I could only do the necessary things, and then I had to rest. And that spring, the crops came in at the same time as every other spring, neither better nor worse. And I realized that the worrying and the hurrying had been for me, not for the crops. The crops were always going to do what they were going to do. He paused. Then he said, "The grief is the same, I think. You can worry at it and hurry it and try to pull it forward faster. It will still take the time it takes, and you will be much more tired." The young farmer sat with this. It was not comfortable advice. He had hoped for something more active. But over the years, he came to understand what the old farmer had meant. The patience was not resignation. It was a form of respect. Respect for the process that had its own timing, its own seasons, its own ways of moving. Grief has its own seasons. You cannot know from inside the winter how long the winter is. You can only continue to tend the things that need tending, to do the small and necessary things, and to trust that the seasons will turn, not because you force them to, but because that is what seasons do. Consider also this small story, which is perhaps the simplest of all the stories tonight. There was an old man who sat every morning in front of his house and watched the day begin. He had done this for many years. He had lived through much. The loss of his wife, the loss of several close friends, the particular diminishments of age. People sometimes stopped to speak with him, and they always came away feeling steadier, though they could not always say why. One morning, a young woman sat with him and asked, "What do you think about when you sit here every morning?" He said, "Nothing much. I watch the light change. I notice what birds are here today and what birds aren't. I feel the temperature of the air. I have my tea." She said, "And that helps?" He said, "I don't know that it helps exactly, but it reminds me. Every morning there's a new light, something slightly different from yesterday. The birds shift. The air has changed a little. And I remember, this is what happens. Everything is always slightly different from yesterday, even when you think it isn't. And that's enough to make me willing to see what today will be. This is patience, not the gritted teeth kind, the watching the light kind, the willingness to see what today will be. And inside that willingness, there is a kind of quiet hope. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that insists on a particular outcome. Just the simple openness of someone who has seen enough mornings to know that no two are quite the same. Rest now. Feel the particular quality of this hour, the late quiet, the way the night has deepened around you. Everything is very still. Your body is still. Your breath is still doing its patient work. The grief is still here. And also, somewhere in this moment, there is the beginning of the smallest possible patience, the willingness to let the night continue, to let the morning come when it comes, to trust that something is working, even now, in the quiet. We are moving now, toward the place where we gather things together, toward the end of our long walk tonight. Let us take a little time with the gathering, with the image of an ordinary person who carries everything we have talked about, without knowing that she does. Someone simply living, and in her living, embodying what all the teaching has been reaching toward. There is a woman who lives in a small house at the edge of a field. She is not remarkable in any external way. She is not a teacher or a healer or someone that anyone would write about. She is simply a person who has lived a life. And her life, like all lives, has contained both what she would have chosen and what she would not. She lost someone she loved some years ago, The loss was real, and it was large, and it changed the shape of her life in the way that large losses do, permanently, irrevocably, in ways she is still discovering. She did not recover quickly. She did not perform her grief neatly or finish it on any schedule. She simply lived alongside it, day by day, doing the ordinary things that needed doing. She tended her house. She cooked her meals. She sat sometimes in the early morning before the day began, with her hands around a cup of something warm, looking out at the field. In those morning sittings, she was not meditating in any formal sense. She was not following any teaching. She was simply being there, the light coming up over the field, the cup in her hands, the grief present, and also the light, both present, both real, both allowed to be exactly what they were, without one being required to disappear in order for the other to exist. Over the years, without her trying to make it happen, something shifted in her. The grief did not leave. She would not have said it left, but it settled. It found its place. It became, as one of the stories tonight suggested, part of the fabric rather than something tearing at the fabric. She could speak of the person she had lost with warmth and even with laughter sometimes. She could miss them without being felled by the missing. She could hold the love and the loss in the same breath, without choosing between them. And she had become, without intending to, someone that other people turned to when they were in grief, not because she had answers or methods or any particular wisdom she could hand over and explain, but because she had been somewhere, because she did not flinch, because she could sit with someone in their pain without needing the pain to hurry toward being finished. She had the cook's quality, the quality that said, "You can be here in this kitchen, carrying what you carry, and we will chop the carrots together." She did not know the old teachings by name. She had not studied impermanence as a philosophy or read the ancient texts, but she had lived it. She had been shown, by loss itself, that things change, that grief changes, that the self that carries the grief changes, that the morning light is different every day, that something in the continuing is itself a kind of answer, perhaps the only kind that is ever really given. She was the muddy water that had been left to settle. She was the student who stopped stirring and found that the water cleared on its own. She was the woman who had loved her garden well. She was the traveler who had crossed the plain through all kinds of weather and said at the end, it was all kinds of things. She was the old man whose stone had been worn smooth by years of carrying. She was the grandmother setting the stone back on the beach and saying, the feeling stays. She was simply a person who had lived, and in the living, had quietly become something wiser and more spacious than she had been. Not because she had tried to become it, because she had simply continued, one day after another, holding what was hers to hold, and trusting, not always, not without difficulty, but on balance, most of the time, that the holding was enough. You are in the middle of that becoming right now. You may not be able to feel it. The middle of things rarely announces itself, but the becoming is happening. Quietly, under the surface, in the dark. The way roots grow and bread rises, and the tide turns without fanfare. The water is settling. The stone is being worn smooth. The morning is already preparing itself for when it comes. We have walked a long way together tonight. We have walked through old stories and gentle images, through a woman in a frost-touched garden, and a jar of muddy water, and a man counting stones at the sea's edge, through a cook in her kitchen, and two students who went into the world, through travelers on a wide plain, and farmers watching the seasons, through the grandmother who set the stone down and kept the feeling, through the musician who heard her teacher's voice in her own hands, through the child who came down from the tall tree one branch at a time, through the simple, extraordinary morning sitting of a woman at the edge of a field. We have walked through the idea that all things pass, including grief, including its shape and its weight. We have walked through the idea of open hands. We have walked through the rain that is just rain, and the rain that is the story about rain. We have walked through the sky that holds all the weather. We have walked through the body that carries the grief faithfully, asking nothing in return. We have walked through the vast company of all the people who have ever lain awake in the dark with something heavy in their chest, and through the recognition that you are not alone among them. And now we are here, at the end of the walking, in the quietest part of the night. You do not have to remember any of it, not the names of the ideas or the turns of the stories, or any particular phrase that was offered along the way. What is useful in what you have heard tonight has already made its way into you, the way water makes its way into earth, quietly, without effort, without your having to do anything to assist it. The settling has been happening all this time, underneath the words, underneath the listening. You do not have to hold it. It is already held. There is nothing to do now. There is nowhere to be. The grief that is present is allowed to be present, fully, without apology, without timeline. It does not need to be fixed tonight. It does not need to be smaller or lighter or more resolved. It can simply rest here alongside you, the way everything in this room rests tonight. The furniture and the dark and the sounds of the world outside, all of it simply here, simply continuing, making no demands. You've been carrying something. You've been carrying it for some time, longer than felt entirely comfortable, and you have done this without being asked to, because it was yours to carry, and there was no other way. That carrying is something. It is not nothing. It is, in its own quiet and unannounced way, a testament to the love that made the loss possible in the first place. You grieve because you loved, and you loved because you were capable of it, and that capacity is not diminished by the grief. If anything, and this is what the old teachers kept noticing, it is deepened by it. Tonight, the carrying can rest. You can set it down on the floor beside the bed. It will be there in the morning if it needs to be. It knows where you live. It will find its way back. But for these sleeping hours, you do not have to hold it. Let your body be completely held by the bed beneath you. Every part of you, the back of your head, your shoulders, your spine, the length of your arms, the backs of your legs, the heels of your feet, simply placed, simply held. You are not required to be anywhere else. You are not required to be anything other than what you are right now. A person in a bed in the dark, breathing, alive in the company of the night. The breath moves. It has been moving this whole time, faithfully, without your having to manage it. In and out, easy as water finding its own level, easy as the turning of seasons, which turns without effort, without anyone having to make it happen. Let the eyes be soft behind their lids. Let the face be easy and unclenched. Let the shoulders finally fully release what they have been holding through this whole long day. The weight of being a person in the world, the weight of being a person who is carrying something heavy and has carried it faithfully. You have been loved, you have loved, and that love, wherever it lives now, whatever form it has taken or is taking, whether it lives on in you or in the world or in ways you cannot yet see, is real and is yours and cannot be taken from you. not by loss, not by time, not by the long, strange distance that opens up between us and the things we have loved. The love crossed that distance, and it is in you now, and it will remain. The feeling stays. The stone can be set down, and the feeling stays. The water is clearing. The sediment is drifting down, slowly in the dark. The light will come in its own time, at its own unhurried pace, and it will be slightly different from yesterday's light, because it always is, because nothing is ever quite the same twice, because impermanence is not only loss, it is also the guarantee of the next new thing. It is also the morning that has never come before. It is also the light that will fall on you differently tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days of this life that are still ahead. But that is for tomorrow. Tonight is for rest. Tonight is for lying here in the dark and letting the breath do its patient work, and letting the body be held and letting the grief be here alongside you without the need to fight it, and letting the night do what the night does, which is hold everything in its own particular patient quiet, without judgment, without urgency, without asking anything of you at all. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are not doing it wrong. You are a person who has loved something and is living in the truth of that love. And that truth has weight, and the weight is real. And tonight the weight is allowed to be exactly what it is. Sleep now. The night is long enough. The morning is coming. You do not have to do anything to make it come. You only have to be here, in this breath, in this body, in this particular darkness that is yours tonight. Rest now. Sleep well. Thank you for walking this far tonight, and for trusting this quiet with whatever you brought to it. Sleep well.